What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? Welcome back here to Before the Whistle again. I'm your host, Maddy, and I'm going to try my best to break down what we saw for the Tulane Green Wave going into the NFL draft this weekend. So I don't know if there are Packers fans listening in on this, if there are Titans fans that have come back for a little more insight, or for some of the undrafted free agents. I'm going to try to get to as much as I can on today's episode, where we did see two Tulane players go in the NFL draft, with Jha'Quan Jackson being drafted by the Tennessee Titans in round 6, and then Michael Pratt, which is something I'm going to get into on this show. Somewhat surprising fall to the 7th round, where he was eventually taken by the Green Wave Packers. The Green Wave Packers. That's just perfect. The Green Bay Packers. And then ever since then, we've seen that flurry of free agency really start to come through, where we saw Jarius Monroe, one of the defensive backs for Tulane, go over to the New York Jets. Sincere Haynesworth and Cameron Wire, two offensive linemen for Tulane, going over to the Saints as undrafted free agents. Defensive back Lance Robinson going to the Cincinnati Bengals. Wide receiver Lawrence Keys over to the Buffalo Bills. Darius Hodges over to the Carolina Panthers. And then you have Cam Pettisclo going over to the New York Giants. So there's a ton going on all across the board. And I'm going to keep following those signings as those really go along. But today's episode, I really want to focus on the guys that were, drafted in. Jha'Quan Jackson, who talk about making your dreams come true for someone that was one of those late Senior Bowl invites, ended up really making the most out of every second of that practice down in Mobile. And I remember him telling me along the way that his dream was to play for the Titans and get to play alongside Tyjae one more time. And so to see that really come to fruition with him being with Tyjae Spears together on that draft day, it really is just very special to watch these types of things unfold. So that was really exciting. But I know that a lot of Tulane fans, especially after the Senior Bowl, especially after the way that this quarterback class was really touted, probably were very surprised. There was some expectation of where that second tier of quarterbacks, which included Spencer Rattler and Michael Pratt, would start to fall. But while we saw a historical amount of quarterbacks be taken in the first round, we also then saw a historical kind of stopgap in between what ended up happening there. So that really intrigued me. And so this episode, I'm kind of going to focus on what kind of went the way that it did with quarterbacks, what we can really learn from the past, and whether or not where your draft position is really makes a difference or not. It clearly does, but there's something to be said about the amount of first round draft picks over the last couple of seasons for the NFL that are not on their starting places and aren't really those starters or franchise quarterbacks, with several of these classes that were touted as these all-time draft classes completely blown up. Guys are all in a bunch of different teams. And then we saw also, I believe, a record amount of undrafted free agents take the field last year. If nothing else, just a huge quarterback health problem in the NFL across the board, which was one of the reasons that I assumed, Michael Pratt would go a little earlier than he did. And ultimately, there's only so much that we from the outside know about these draft processes. But at the end of the day, when everyone kept asking me, where do I project these guys to go? I don't really know, and I don't really care from my perspective. For me, what I was looking for more than anything was fit. And if you ask me, as much as it seemed kind of unbelievable at the time that he was drafted, I think Michael Pratt really ended up with both a good situation and a good fit. And you can only ask for that much in all rounds of the NFL draft, let alone the 7th round, where you start to get to the point of, would it be better off in free agency, getting able to kind of pick your destination? So I'll weigh the pros and cons of that, and really kind of looking into the Packers draft history to see what we can really see for Michael Pratt's future in the NFL, and what that draft process really says about the NFL, about the evaluation of quarterbacks as a whole, and what we from the outside can do our best to learn from. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid too. Well, if you know me at all, then you know two things. One, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And two, if I were in it for the money, I'd certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials each and every week. And we have something really exciting in the works coming out, I believe, next month there at Blue Oak from the drink category. But in the meantime, go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, located at 900 North Carrollton Avenue here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. And back again to these April specials. Monday, you stick to your classic with your red beans and rice. You got a chicken mole on Tuesdays. That looks really delicious just based on that picture. And then you keep it simple on Wednesday with the house smoked turkey sandwich with guacamole, arugula, and killer wheat bread. And that is definitely something that I am looking forward to trying over at Blue Oak for sure. So go get yourself some specials. As I will keep disclaiming as I do any evaluations or analysis related to quarterbacks, I do not pretend to be a quarterback guru or expert in any way, and I don't pretend to know how to really make any projections. I know how to look at trends. I know how to look throughout the NFL. I know how to look at football. All that to say, I'm not really going to go into the weeds that much of what each team ended up taking and whether or not I think that's a fit for their offense, because I just don't know that much intricately about all of the coaching situations in the NFL, all of the offensive situations, all of really what each team's needs were going into this draft. But there were some obvious ones that you could have looked at here and there as potential landing places for Michael Pratt, where you have the obvious teams in those top couple of draft spots with the Bears, the Commanders, the Patriots, Vikings, and Broncos as kind of those quarterback needy teams, if you will. But then I would really consider that second tier of quarterback needy teams to be the Jets, for one, the Raiders, the Giants, to name a few of them. The Packers weren't necessarily that high up on my list. And in fact, some of these teams that ended up signing undrafted free agent quarterbacks, you kind of wonder whether or not they were looking at Michael Pratt with one of those last draft picks. One of those teams being the Raiders, who ended up signing Carter Bradley from South Alabama, who Michael Pratt outdueled in week one of that 2023 season. The Seahawks were another team that looked like a potential one. They ended up signing a quarterback from San Jose State that I just don't know much about. The Bengals, who had to start an undrafted free agent in Jake Browning several times last year, ended up picking up Rocky Lombardi from Northern Illinois. John Rice Plumlee, who Tulane fans know relatively well, went over to the Steelers. The Dolphins ended up signing someone from UTEP. And then the 49ers took Tanner Mordecai from Wisconsin. And that was another potential landing spot that I could have seen Michael Pratt going. You know, we'd heard the Cowboys potentially, but I was really looking at the Raiders as one of those teams because last year they had Aiden O'Connell, who I believe was a 4th round draft pick for them. I'm trying to find him on my list of all of these quarterbacks now, ends up taking over in lieu of Jimmy Garoppolo. And then they also have Gardner Minshew, who, for what it's worth, was a 6th round draft pick. Not really that much of an answer, though, in terms of what your quarterback room was. And then the Jets, I think where everyone started to get surprised. So the way that we saw the NFL draft go this year was picks 1 through 3, quarterback. Caleb Williams, as we all know him, goes over to the Bears. Jaden Daniels from LSU goes to the Commanders. And then Drake May goes over to the Falcons. And at that point, it was kind of a question of, is this run going to kind of continue at this point? Because there's kind of this discussion I've seen going around of the fact that some of the quarterbacks taken in round 1 might not have been projected to be that way, but you start to see these runs happen. And I was on the radio on Friday, I want to say, Thursday. Nope, it was draft day at the Zurich Classic. And I was talking about the Saints just in relation to trading back and the idea that I think a lot of teams overestimate their ability to evaluate those kind of hits and surefire guys in the draft. And are you sometimes better off trading back, getting a few more picks, and kind of being able to see what you do with that in terms of probability? I think it's easier to said than done to take that type of thought process if you are one of these quarterback needy teams early up in the draft. But I think what really caught everyone's surprise was Michael Penix going over to the Falcons, mainly because they had just signed Kirk Cousins to a $100 million contract. And the idea that he came over to be the starter of the team, for that kind of analysis of that conversation, I mean, Kirk Cousins is coming off of an Achilles tear. It's not a bad idea to invest draft capital in that, but did you need to invest it as early as they did? Well, that'll be a question that kind of remains to be seen. But in doing that, I think that kind of spooked some of the teams that perhaps were looking to kind of see what that run would look like at quarterback, where then you saw a trade happen where the Vikings, who were slated to pick, I believe, 11th, traded with the Jets, presumably that the Jets were fielding several calls and they wanted to make sure that they got their guy in JJ McCarthy. And so then you end up with the Broncos at number 12 who take Bo Nix. And all of a sudden, 50% of the top 12 of the NFL draft class is quarterbacks. And I don't know if all of those quarterbacks are really anticipated by all these teams to go in round one. So suddenly you have teams on the back half of the first round that can look at all of the defense allowed to them. There were a few offensive tackles taken, but for the most part, that really just left, I think, a lot of guys on the board that teams perhaps might not have been expecting. And I tend to believe in runs being a real thing. It's kind of what I see happen every single year in the NFL. You start to see teams trade and have this idea that, okay, well, quickly there's going to be no one at that position left. So I would have been really curious to see what would have happened if, for example, Michael Penix and Bo Nix didn't go as early as they did. If they went in, round 2 or round 3, does that affect where Spencer Rattler ends up going? I just kind of feel like, I talk about psychology all the time here, and ultimately we're not going to be in all of the draft rooms, but I think there are just so many biases and phenomenons that end up happening when you're in this cycle of everyone making decisions independent yet very reliant on one another. I think of things like the bystander effect, for example, where it's surprising to outside people to see a group of people standing around while someone is being attacked, someone's choking, and why is everyone just kind of standing around doing nothing? Why is no one speaking up? I wonder how much of the time that kind of happens in draft rooms where you're on a clock, there's someone that has their guy, and how much are we really stepping back and thinking about our ability to evaluate here and whether or not we're getting wrapped up in the idea of, okay, well, here's what this run is, here's what the draft is looking like. I think you really should just be focusing on which players you want to be getting. But for one reason or another, we then proceeded to see the longest draft in, I believe it was NFL history, I want to say, between where quarterbacks were taken so early on, with Bo Nix being the last quarterback selected at 12, and then no one all the way until Spencer Rattler in round 5. So at that point, if you're looking at these tiers of quarterbacks, I guess, and you were seeing Spencer Rattler and Michael Pratt as kind of that same tier of quarterback, is it a conversation about competition? It might be one that you have to think about having, although I look back at some of these quarterbacks from years past and you look at first-round draft picks of guys like Josh Allen that came out of Wyoming, Trey Lance that came out of North Dakota, as well as Carson Wentz who came out of North Dakota. These are FCS programs. So we talk about all this level of competition in the SEC, but it doesn't always seem to matter when it's just one of these kind of quarterbacks coming from these smaller programs. I just think that it does matter, and scouts should be looking at these type of things when they're evaluating this type of stuff. But every year it just goes to show that it only matters to a degree that much. And I kind of look at it as the same thing as their perception of where you go based on whatever round in the draft. You're more likely to end up in a situation where they want you earlier on in the draft, but are you going to a good situation for yourself? Are you going somewhere where you have a shot in the room whatsoever? Because as surprising as it was that Michael Pratt fell all the way to round 7, walking away from the draft, if I'm Michael Pratt, I'm feeling a lot better about my viability on the roster and at least the team that drafted me than I am if I'm Spencer Rattler, who went 2 rounds earlier than him. And quite frankly, I would apply that to the quarterbacks taken ahead of him, including Jordan Travis. That was a little bit of a surprise for fans too. And as I said, I don't watch enough about quarterbacks to really criticize a move here or there. What I do know is the Jets have another quarterback coming off of an Achilles tear, and Achilles tears can happen again. And when you always tend to see these secondary injuries. All that to say, it's a risky room. So to me, it was an even bigger risk to bring in a guy that is coming off of an injury. But that room is really thin. And if Aaron Rodgers goes down, all of a sudden a guy that was taken later on in the draft, seen as a developmental guy, is all of a sudden that guy. And how much time has he had this offseason to get settled? Joe Milton to the Patriots, presumably they're going to try to do something gadget-like with him. I mean, they spent that capital on Drake May and they're moving forward with him. Devin Leary to the Ravens. The Ravens are always an interesting team to me in terms of how they draft and evaluate talent. So I'm sure they saw something there. But there's really no pathway for any of those quarterbacks in those later rounds to get onto the field in any meaningful way outside an injury to QB1. And that all said, there were a lot of injuries to QB1 and QB2 last year, and QB3 for that matter. There were multiple undrafted free agents that were playing meaningful football time last year, where you saw Tommy DeVito for the Giants play half the year, which was incredibly surprising that they kind of decided to stick with that. Someone that you've seen as a journeyman in the NFL, Taylor Heineke, another undrafted free agent, Tyson Bagent, an undrafted free agent, started and played for the Bears last year, as I said before, for Cincinnati, Jake Browning. And then you just have, on top of that, a ton of 6th, 7th round draft picks that also played quite a bit of time last year. So yeah, I was actually pretty surprised to see that so many teams declined to take a prospect like Michael Pratt. When you looked at the value in round, I mean, to me, the Packers just got an absolute steal at the end of the day. And the Packers are a team that, if you're going to trust what they're saying about developing quarterbacks and actually having a plan for them, they're one of those teams that have that kind of small historical precedence. Looking back at their draft history, it is true. They trade for Brett Favre in 1992 after intending to take him in the draft that year. And then they start to kind of go through just this farm of drafting these late round quarterbacks, either having them become the backups or trading them on for draft capital, going on to have those careers, starting with Mark Brunell, drafted in round 5 of 1993. He competed with Ty Detmer, who was drafted in the 9th round the year prior, to be the backup for Brett Favre, ended up becoming that, came in for him while he was injured, and then ended up being traded to Jacksonville to a 3-year contract where he was selected to the Pro Bowl 3 times, made 2 AFC championship appearances. It just spent a really long time as a career player over there in Jacksonville. Then you have Matt Hasselbeck, who you kind of heard them compare Michael Pratt to, where he was drafted to be Favre's backup in round 6 of the 1998 draft. He was then traded on to Seattle in 2001. He followed over their coach that went from Green Bay over to Seattle. And so they end up trading for him, and he becomes their all-time franchise leader in completions and passing yards, makes the Pro Bowl 3 times, takes the Seahawks to a Super Bowl, ultimately goes on to have a really strong playing career. Saints fans that are listening to this, hello, Aaron Brooks, round 4 of 1999. He ends up being traded to Green Bay after Mike McCarthy, who was the quarterback's coach for the Packers, ends up becoming the OC for the Saints. They initially inquired about Matt Hasselbeck. He wasn't available, and so they traded for Aaron Brooks. He ended up taking over as a starter for New Orleans. Matt Flynn, round 7, 2008. Same year, they drafted a guy in round 2 who was Brian Boehm. Matt Flynn ends up beating him out in competition for the backup role in training camp, ends up making that very notable start against the Patriots, and then ends up signing a 3-year deal with the Seahawks. He ended up losing out to Russell Wilson in that competition, but all of these guys legitimately getting second chances at these types of careers. And then, you also look at, I think it was, Brett Huntley. He also ends up getting traded after Rodgers broke his collarbone. He comes in as a starter, ends up beating out their backup for that QB2 role, and then he gets traded on over to Seattle. So that's pretty much every quarterback that they've drafted, save for the guys that they've taken with the intention to start in Aaron Rodgers and in Jordan Love. And I remember how much that pick of Jordan Love was kind of looked at by the Packers, but you really do have to start to look back and see that they are a team that actually takes these later rounds seriously and sees the value in these late round quarterbacks, either becoming valuable backups for their own teams or becoming valuable trade capital for other teams. I mean, there is also a very good chance that Michael Pratt ends up on a different team next season because of the way we saw injuries go throughout the NFL last year. And I think that's really what's more important than anything else is there's an opportunity long-term, but he also ends up somewhere where they have this precedent of drafting quarterbacks. And even though they ended up taking a quarterback to see our last year in, what's his name? Now I am completely blanking on who this quarterback is. That is their backup quarterback, Sean Clifford. He's their backup. They took him in the 5th round of the 2023 NFL draft, and they like him as a backup, but I don't understand why teams aren't taking these late round flyers more often than not. And I really thought that this would be the year that we would start to see some of these quarterbacks get a little bit more of an opportunity in these later rounds. Something that I think is going to be really interesting to look at long term is how much the later round draft picks were affected by the NFL changing these kickoff rules, where all of a sudden you're looking for entirely new prototypes of guys that you might not have on your roster anymore. Guys that you picked up in the last couple of years as those special teams guys, not really fitting the prototype for what you need to do in those roles. And I noticed you saw some bigger guys get selected in those later rounds. And I think it's just going to change a lot for the NFL. So I think you saw a lot of these teams kind of looking at, do we need to fill out our special teams in this way? Because ultimately, you're not going to be having your quarterback play special teams. I was just kind of surprised to see teams, like I said, the Jets end up taking Jordan Travis. That's their decision. But the Raiders and the Giants really declining to address that position, picking up guys in free agency. Sure, Michael Pratt could have gotten to that point, but I think there is something to be said about being wanted by a team, even though it is kind of the end of the draft. I think there's just more intent because you ultimately have to shell out more money for that role. And I think that he ends up in a situation where he not only has a good chance at backup, but I'm not saying anything about Jordan Love. I don't know that much about him as a quarterback. I know he started and played really well for the Packers this last season. But if there's any team to look at and say that nothing is guaranteed, it's certainly that team who have now replaced Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers by these younger guys that they end up drafting, and over the years have taken these later round quarterbacks, something they kind of stopped for a little while, but their GM saying that's something they wanted to get back to in this year's draft. And then you look at them taking, again, a 5th round draft pick quarterback in last year's draft, and then using a 7th rounder on Michael Pratt this year. But you look at all the examples of these quarterbacks that they've drafted where multiple of them have been taken as a 3rd round guy and have beat out the incumbent backup or a guy that was drafted in the case of, I think it was Matt Flynn, in round 2 versus round 7. It just goes to show that sometimes all you really need is a shot. And for me, if I'm Michael Pratt, I certainly have a chip on my shoulder, but I also know that I'm not just competing to be that emergency quarterback. I have a real shot at being the backup quarterback here. And I think that just really helps guys dig within. And so I'm going to just be really curious to follow along his journey throughout this preseason, throughout this offseason. There's guys that are going to be disappointed that they're drafted late and maybe they check out if they don't see an immediate path to starting on the field. I think that got people that know Michael Pratt, if there are outside fans listening to this, something you don't have to worry about with Michael Pratt is his competitive nature, his competitive toughness, the way that he just rises for his team and takes any competition and runs with it. I think he really thrives on it, to be honest. Doesn't play football until 9th grade, becomes a starter at his high school, transfers to a high school with a sitting quarterback, beats him out for the starting role, comes into Tulane, ends up coming off the bench a few weeks into his freshman year and never looks back with the starting role. And in a era of the transfer portal and being able to go on to these teams and NIL, he chooses to stay with Tulane and build the program. Now, is that going to be a decision that people look back on and say, oh, maybe he should have transferred over to one of these Power 5 programs? Then I look at someone like Sam Hartman, who ended up transferring for that 1 year, and it didn't really end up mattering for him that much at the end of the day. I just think you can pick apart things until you're blue in the face. I think it's hard to ignore Michael Pratt getting injured at the end of week 1 of the 23 year, missing out on one of those really big competition games against Ole Miss. And ultimately, we don't know what his health was like throughout the year, throughout that point. But if you look back on that, does that have more of an impact than, deciding to transfer elsewhere? I just think that you can really pick that stuff apart. And then you can look at someone like Brock Purdy, who is a very similar situation. And it's not just because he was taken in the 7th round of the NFL draft. It's because he was a 4-year starter at the same program, learned how to really take that on and be a leader in that way. And I just think that takes a different sort of intangibles than going over to a team and being that kind of final assembled piece. And you saw immediately how mature and ready for an NFL roster Brock Purdy was in that aspect. And I think you're going to see that translate really well with Michael Pratt just as much. But I just think for him, if there is any chance that he could see the field at all, he is going to take it, because the Packers got lucky that Jordan Love was relatively healthy last year. They were one of the few teams that had that luxury of their starting quarterback basically making it all the way to the end of the year. It last year showed me that it is very hard to predict the health of your quarterback room, and you need to have QBs 1 through 3 really, really hammered out there. So I think some of these guys, you look at someone like Spencer Rattler, he goes to a situation where there is a starter, there are 2 veteran backups on the roster now, and then there's a 4th round draft pick from the year prior in Jake Haener. Where am I really fitting into that equation here? Again, Jordan Travis, his spot is fairly obvious, though there's a lot of pressure on him. Devin Leary, I'm not really entirely sure. And again, I think Joe Milton, I'm not really sure what his viability is as a quarterback. So like I said before, even though he misses out on quite a bit of money opportunity and just I'm sure a little more sense of security, I think Michael Pratt ends up somewhere with a good situation and a good fit. There is no veteran presence there. Jordan Love is the biggest veteran, but he's been largely kind of sitting back and behind Aaron Rodgers up until this last season. This is his first season with real playing time as a starter. Then you have a 2nd-year, 5th-round draft pick as the backup, and then you have Michael Pratt. So it's a really young room, and it's a really intriguing one to really follow from here on out. So I'm just going to be looking forward to that. At the end of the day, I don't know what happened. I think that Michael Pratt deserved to go a lot sooner than he did, but I don't think that the NFL always really knows how to evaluate quarterbacks through and through. And more often than not, I just kind of wonder if some teams are willing to go out on a limb. Because I keep seeing all this stuff about teams not wanting to waste these later round draft picks on what's considered a premium position or, one not of need. To me, quarterbacks should always be of need, especially when it comes to injury, especially when it comes to the fact that these guys all of a sudden just have been having really inconsistent years here and there. You get some injuries to the O-line all of a sudden, and now you're looking at a completely different picture. But you just look back at some of these really highly touted draft classes where here's the 1st round of the 2018 draft class. Baker Mayfield goes to Cleveland. He's now on his 3rd team. He's actually done really well for himself and kind of fought back into becoming a starter. Then you have Sam Darnold, who went over to the New York Jets, got traded multiple times. I think he's in Minnesota now. Josh Allen was the one that worked from that. Josh Rosen drafted by the Cardinals. He ends up getting traded out of the league. And then Lamar Jackson by Baltimore. Then you actually had Mason Rudolph come out of the 3rd round in that draft class and Mike White come out in that draft class as well. And quite honestly, those guys have been as valuable to the league as Josh Rosen has. And I think Sam Darnold has really gotten a really good second lease on life, but things were really looking bad when him, PJ Walker, who I believe was undrafted, and Baker Mayfield are all competing in Carolina in this weird quarterback competition. Then you have the year prior to that. RIP to Dwayne Haskins. He ends up going in the 1st round of the Commanders. Daniel Jones goes 6 overall to the Giants. I guess he's still starting and he's still playing, although he barely played last year. And then Tommy DeVito played the whole season for them. Kyler Murray for the Cardinals being that only one that's with his original team. Gardner Minshew came out around 6 in that draft class, which I find to be very interesting as he's become kind of one of those journeymen. Then you look at the 2022 draft class as well. Kenny Pickett, he was the only 1st rounder traded. Then you saw that kind of 2nd tier of quarterbacks where I think that's something, if all those guys hadn't gone so early on, we might have seen this pan out differently. In this year's draft class with that Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis, and Matt Corral kind of 3rd round run that we saw, Desmond Ridder is traded. Malik Willis is buried on the depth chart, and Matt Corral is playing for the Birmingham Stallions. Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, Justin Fields, they are in a draft class that includes Mac Jones and Trevor Lawrence, only one of those people still being on their original teams. Zach Wilson just got traded. Trey Lance, number 3rd overall pick, got beat out by the 7th overall pick. Justin Fields, he got traded overall on, and so did Mac Jones. Davis Mills is the only one existing from that class still on his team, and I believe Kyle Trask too, for that matter. Davis Mills going in the 3rd round. All that to say, I think you can see the number 1 1st overall draft pick. Presumably they're going to work. But what happens if they don't? Because that's happened so many times on these teams of these guys that are going to bad situations. And looking at these careers, is Michael Pratt worse off than a Kenny Pickett or a Desmond Ridder or a Mac Jones or any of these guys, Zach Wilson for that matter, that all kind of got screwed up in their first journeys and then got spit out elsewhere and are trying to find their way onto a team? Whereas there's no negative perception and there's no bad habits or things to undo with Michael Pratt. Sure, you have bad college habits, but you're getting a lot more cleaner of a start than some guy that got bounced around from all these different rosters. So to me, I don't think every team knows how to evaluate quarterbacks that well. And I don't think a lot of teams are always willing to go out on a limb and say, we don't care that this guy is from this school, this program, what have you. Except I keep saying that. And then I look at these guys like Trey Lance that were drafted third overall and came from an SCS program. So who knows at the end of the day? Who knows why Michael Pratt fell? Who knows why all these quarterbacks went to where they did? But there are some situations where, again, the first rounder, Michael Pratt's probably in a better immediate situation in terms of chemistry, development, and not having a quarterback controversy in the way that they just created for the Falcons. He gets to go somewhere and just genuinely focus on being a better guy at what he does, learning, developing, getting to know this room. He's under a really good quarterback developer in Matt LaFleur, who's now done this with multiple quarterbacks at this point. It's going to be really fascinating for number 7, who went in round 7. And so that's where I'm going to kind of end my rant today on whatever quarterback draft history is, the amount of undrafted free agents we saw take the field last year for that matter, and then that kind of surprising amount of teams that decided not to address that position in the draft and sign some guys as undrafted free agents, where I think you're just going to get a little more of that firepower out of someone like Michael Pratt, who I think everyone can agree should have gone much earlier than he did. But it just goes to show how random of a beast the NFL draft is and why it's not really a pleasure covering it from my perspective, just because I know these guys, that day really weighs on you when it starts at 11 and round 7 is something like 6 p.m. Central Time. And I'm stressed out just as an outsider. And then you think about these guys who their lives are just up in the air until they get a phone call from whichever team. So knowing that on this side of things, it just makes it a little harder, but I'm excited for all these guys that got these opportunities. I want to dive more now that I have some time into the Titans roster and see what exciting things you guys have in store for Tyjae Spears and Jha'Quan Jackson now going on there. But I just kind of wanted to do a recap of this draft, what quarterback draft history is looking like, and why Michael Pratt, despite being the last quarterback drafted in the NFL draft this year, actually has probably the best path to victory, if you will, outside of all the guys taken in round 1. And so with that, y'all, I will see you on Friday.